Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole bunch of sources, articles, research notes, and really dig in deep. We're hunting for those key insights, the stuff that really matters, so you can get properly informed fast. Today, we are taking that deep dive into Mongolia. Our sources paint this picture of a really fascinating place. Vast, huge, geographical diversity, grasslands, deserts, mountains.
And that iconic Eurasian steppe you can't forget.
Exactly. And it's got this history that's, incredibly rich, complex, and the sources say it really shaped Mongolia as this crucial link between East and West.
Oh, absolutely. And what a history it is. I mean, the material we've got here, it covers millennia. We're talking earliest human traces right up to, modern politics, modern economics.
Yeah.
It's definitely a challenge to pull all that together. But that's the mission, right? Navigate the journey, pinpoint those key moments, and figure out why Mongolia's story is so compelling and frankly relevant even now.
We are looking at sources covering, pretty much everything. These incredibly ancient settlements, the domestication of the horse, which sounds like a total game changer, the rise and honestly the mind-boggling scale of the Mongol Empire, then centuries under foreign rule, that fight for independence, and how Mongolia is dealing with the 21st century. Okay, so let's start unpacking this right at the beginning then. These sources, they push the timeline way back. Human settlement on the Mongolian plateau, maybe 800,000 years ago. That's incredible.
It is.
When you look at those super early times, what kind of picture starts to emerge? What were the foundations like?
Well, what really stands out immediately is just how deeply tied early human life was to that environment you mentioned. Diverse, demanding,
Right.
especially the steppe.
Right.
And archaeology, genetics, too, they trace these really significant cultural shifts. You see this transition from maybe more hunter-gatherer groups towards the first pastoralists. It wasn't like flipping a switch,
No, a long process.
A very long process. People adapting how they lived, how they used the land.
And it sounds like one development was just central to all of that adapting.
Absolutely central. The domestication of the horse. The sources are really clear on this. It was the transformative event.
More than just transport.
Oh, way more.
Yeah.
It basically enabled this mobile, animal-focused economy. It let people really use those huge grasslands effectively. And that laid the groundwork for the whole nomadic lifestyle that defined the region for just centuries.
And even before we get to the Mongols themselves, the name that everyone knows, the sources talk about earlier nomadic empires on the steppe, like the Xiongnu, the Uyghur Khaganate.
Exactly. They weren't the Mongols, obviously, but the sources note they had cultural differences, sure, but the historical record shows definite similarities, similar nomadic structures, similar impact on their neighbors, and all that movement, that nomadic life, it created these deep connections across the steppe. Ancient DNA studies the material, mentions this show populations mixing over time, tied directly to these mobile ways of life. There's even mention of one specific key migration, this group called the Todo. Their genetic influence is apparently still visible today. It just underlines how fundamental movement and interaction are to this region's identity.
And that dynamic between the nomads and the settled people nearby.
Still a reality. That tension, that interaction goes way, way back.
Okay, so we've got this foundation, mobile life, the horse being critical, earlier attempts at empire building. The stage is definitely set for, arguably the most famous bit, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. Our sources describe the Mongols as just masters of the steppe, really leveraging that knowledge of the land, their incredible horsemanship.
Yeah, and the sources detail this fascinating process, right? How these different tribes started coming together in the late 12th century under this one guy, Temujin.
Right.
And his genius, it wasn't just military, though obviously that's huge. It was political, too. He used this mixed diplomacy, but also pretty brutal conquest. And what the sources call a providential vision, basically convincing people he was destined to unite them.
And that all leads to 1206. Temujin is proclaimed Genghis Khan, that's the moment, the birth of the empire. And the scale, it's just staggering.
It really is.
The sources really emphasize, under him and his grandson, Kublai Khan, it became the largest contiguous land empire in history, period.
Just try to picture the geography. One source puts it from Korea all the way to northwest India, from the Volga River deep in Russia across to the Sea of Japan.
Huge.
Another way to think about it, from the Mediterranean, basically, to the North China Sea. From the Elbe River in Europe, again, all the way across to the Sea of Japan. It's immense.
And the immediate impact of that sheer scale, according to sources, it just violently smashed together regions, states, whole civilizations that had been totally separate before.
Unprecedented contact, like a shockwave, as you said, across the known world at the time.
It must have fundamentally changed things like religion, too.
Absolutely. Tengrism was central to the early Mongol beliefs, sure. But the empire's reach meant widespread conversions across the conquered lands. Islam, Buddhism, other faiths. Millions were affected, their religious landscapes totally altered.
Now, here's something really interesting. The sources bring up this debate about climate change.
Ah, yes.
Some sources argue that actually unusually wet conditions, they call them pluvials, during the empire's rise and expansion might have helped fuel it.
The theory being more rain means more grass.
Right, which supports bigger herds, creates more wealth from livestock, maybe a food boom.
And critically, fodder for all those horses that were the key to their military machine.
Exactly. And then conversely, some sources suggest a really severe drought in the 14th century might have been a factor in the empire's eventual collapse.
It's a crucial point, isn't it? Even the biggest land empire ever was still fundamentally tied to the environment of its heartland, vulnerable to it.
So, okay, how did they actually govern this enormous thing? Let's shift to administration and expansion. The sources give a quick sketch of Genghis Khan's early life. Pretty rough. Born around 1162, captured, enslaved, escaped. Seems driven by revenge and ambition.
And that 1206 summit, the Kurultai, it wasn't just about the title. It was critical for legitimizing his rule, consolidating power over all those tribes he'd brought together.
And his strategy for doing that?
The sources explain it was pretty stark. Join me, accept my rule, and you'll benefit. Resist, and you'll be destroyed. Simple choice, really.
And many chose to join.
Most leaders did, yeah. Integration seemed the smarter path. He then focused on actually building a state, enforcing taxes, setting up trade agreements, ensuring freedom of movement, which was key for commerce, and applying the law equally.
That sounds pretty radical for the time across such different peoples.
It was. And what really stands out is his emphasis on merit and loyalty. Not just who your father was. He formed advisory councils based on ability.
And the military strategy driving the expansion.
It was built right out of that nomadic expertise. Revolutionary for its time. Forget slow, heavy infantry. This was a permanent light cavalry force.
Right.
The sources stress its focus, speed, stealth, mobility, surprise, and empowering individual initiative within a coordinated plan, what we call combined arms today, using different units together to smash enemy formations.
And this machine just rolled outwards incredibly fast. The sources talk about expansion into the Balkans, Western China, Himalayan foothills, Mesopotamia, sacking major cities like Mosul.
Taking everything livestock, people for slaves, skilled artisans, extracting wealth and expertise.
But while Genghis Khan kicked it all off, the sources credit his son, well, adopted son, Ogedei Khan, with really building the administration.
Yeah, because governing that huge territory with its established cities, big populations, rich resources that needed more than just military might, Ogedei recognized they needed skilled administrators, statesmen, and they recruited them from across the empire.
And they built a capital, Karakorum, developed what the sources call unprecedented administrative methods. What made them unprecedented?
I think it was the scale, the complexity, managing such diverse places under one single, often mobile authority. It demanded systems for everything, maintaining power bases, policing huge areas, keeping order, raising revenue, projecting the Khan's prestige, fast communication with messengers.
Keeping records.
Written records became crucial, and laws to standardize things. The sources list the fundamental needs. Power bases, capitals, settlements, police, armies, revenue, prestige, messengers, records, laws.
And what's fascinating is how some of that structure, even the messenger routes, lasted longer than the rulers.
Exactly. And maybe the most important lasting legacy of that whole era, those overland links, East Asia, Inner Asia, Persia, the Levant, Western Europe, all connected. For a while, that overland trade actually surpassed sea trade. It truly connected the known world, or the great world, as they put it.
But, like all empires, this peak couldn't last. The sources say it reached its absolute largest extent under Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson.
Right. But pretty soon after his death in 1294, within decades, really, the cracks were showing. Big time. The empire started to fragment.
Why? What happened?
Civil wars, internal rebellions, attacks from outside groups, and just intense factionalism among the Mongol leadership, fighting over who should rule.
And the heartland itself, the Mongolian plateau, became caught up in this.
Became a battleground, yeah. The sources talk about succession contests among Kublai Khan's descendants, the golden princes, they're sometimes called. Just bloodshed, devastated capitals.
And pressure from outside, too.
Oh, yeah. Chinese forces pushing back, Cossack expansion from the north, Tatar tribesmen, other groups like the Saka pressing into Mongol areas. The result, the old heartland is fractured into several competing khanates and eventually kind of perished amid all that conflict.
But interestingly, right in the middle of all this chaos and decline, the sources mention something culturally significant happened.
The history writing.
Yeah, a comprehensive history of the Mongols was written, apparently adopting this sort of pan-Mongolian perspective, maybe trying to hold on to an identity as things fell apart.
Could be. It's notable as one of the first big historical works about the Mongols that actually survived.
Okay, so the empire doesn't just disappear, it splinters after Kublai Khan dies. Into these successor states, khanates, our sources focus a bit on the eastern one, the Golden Horde.
Right, founded by Batu, another grandson of Genghis, and his descendants, those golden princes again. They ended up controlling the Russian steppes for, what, over 200 years?
Yeah, a long time. And the Golden Horde played this important role, didn't it? Like a bridge for trade and diplomacy between Europe and Asia.
Definitely. And a source of manpower for other parts of the fragmented empire, too. It was a major power for a good while until the mid-14th century, holding sway over the Russian principalities.
And the sources mention its focus on royal commerce, organizing these big caravans, sending goods, especially to China. And ironically, that trade actually helped the Muscovite princes rise up.
The very princes who would eventually overthrow the horde, yeah. Interesting twist.
The sources use this term decadence to describe the Golden Horde after maybe 70 years or so. What did they mean by that?
Well, they note that despite some initial organization and economic activity, the constant warfare just wasn't paying off anymore. It was exhausting their resources.
Yeah.
So the sources connect this decadence to what they call rising risk costs, complications, and internal denationing. Basically, the effort and expense of controlling these huge, diverse territories just became too much. The treasury weakened, vigilance dropped, law and order started breaking down. It's presented as almost an inevitable outcome when the costs of running an empire outweigh the benefits you get from it.
So from that incredible peak, we see the heartland fragmenting, successor states like the Golden Horde facing their own issues, which leads us into this incredibly long period where Mongolia itself wasn't fully independent.
A very long period. The sources put it from the late 13th century all the way up to late 1911. That's over 600 years of foreign rule or influence.
Wow. How did the sources break that down?
They kind of divided into three phases. First, late 13th to mid-17th century. That's the immediate aftermath of the empire breaking up. The old heartland is fragmented into different Mongol or steppe tribal states. Interaction between them was limited, even though they shared a heritage.
Okay, phase one. What's phase two?
Phase two, mid-17th, early 20th century. This is defined by growing external powers. Progressive Russian expansion is happening, but the really big one is Qing dynasty rule, which lasted for 2 centuries.
The Qing conquest sounds like a major turning point.
Huge. The Manchus unified their own tribes, conquered China, set up their dynasty. Then they turned their attention to the Mongols. They conquered the main Khalkha-Mongol areas by 1696 and finished the job across the plateau by 1750, often using pretty brutal methods.
And the Qing rule itself, the sources describe it as quite harsh.
Yeah, oppressive feudalism is the term used. They suppressed resistance, brought the traditional Mongol clergy under official control, and extracted tribute from the nomadic economy. It really restricted the traditional way of life, and the sources note things like denying voting rights and personal freedoms.
But people still resisted.
Oh, definitely. Through uprisings or just moving away to areas outside direct Qing control. The sources also mentioned the administrative headaches the Qing faced trying to rule nomads using systems designed for settled Chinese society.
Right. Different worlds.
Exactly. Though many Mongols did find ways to adapt, kept traditions going where they could. And some Mongol elites even played roles within the empires, working as emissaries or spies for both Russia and China. It was complex.
There's a mention in the 18th century of the king actually promoting Mongolian language education. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, yeah. The sources say it did foster some sense of national cohesion, interestingly. But they also lament that the Mongols lacked internal unity at the time, so it didn't translate into a stronger independence movement.
And Russian influence was growing throughout this second period, too.
Constantly. Because of Mongolia's strategic position, sandwiched between them and China. There were maybe some early bombs, shared shamanic traditions, nomadic links, but those faded as Russia modernized along Western lines, while Mongolia remained largely feudal.
Buddhism flourished, though.
Buddhism did, yes.
Yeah.
It created an intellectual elite. But the sources suggest maybe one that lacked a broader view of what was happening globally. And from the mid-19th century, there were apparently deliberate efforts to keep Mongolia isolated, discourage Western knowledge, even forbid Russian in some places.
Oh, so they were really caught in the middle.
Totally squeezed. China pushing from the south, Russia from the north, and then Japan rises as another power, complicating things further. Russia even apparently considered dividing Mongolia with China at one point. Just constant pressure.
That long period of being shaped by outside forces really sets the stage for the fight for independence in the early 20th century. The sources really hammer home how long sovereignty was lost over 500 years.
And the timing was absolutely critical. The Qing dynasty collapses in 1911. Suddenly, there's an opportunity. But it's also chaos, because China itself descends into this period of warlordism from 1912 to 1921.
So an opportunity, but a dangerous one.
Exactly. Local Mongol elites saw their chance amidst this chaos. The sources detail the 1911 revolution. Some Mongols, led by Bog Gagan, declared Outer Mongolia fully independent, setting up the Bog Khan government. He formally declared independence in 1912.
But the external players didn't just disappear. Japan tried to get involved.
They did. Tried to exert influence, made those infamous 21 demands on China, even sent troops in 1913, but it actually backfired with the Mongols. The Bog Khan government wasn't happy, and eventually Japanese forces were expelled after demands they pull back.
And then the Russian Revolution in 1917 adds another huge element.
A massive element. It stirred up independence feelings even more among Mongolian elites, the intelligentsia. And crucially, the new Bolshevik government in Russia offered support.
What was the goal of the independence movement then?
Ambitious. To unite the divided northern and southern Mongols, the Khalkha Plains, into one sovereign state. There was a public call for independence in 1916 after some uprisings against remaining Chinese control.
So they reached out to Russia.
Sent delegates, yeah, looking for recognition aid. And the response was positive recognition, military help, even financial support in gold.
But it wasn't a smooth ride to independence. There was still chaos.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention widespread riots, chaos in different areas, sometimes targeting traditional feudal lords, so it wasn't just about national independence. There were complex internal issues, uprisings from lower down the social ladder, too.
And despite the aspirations?
Despite the aspirations, the lack of broader international support meant Mongolia was still vulnerable, still basically a pawn in this brutal geopolitical game between Russia, China, and, to some extent, Western powers.
And that complex situation, needing external help, really paved the way for the Soviet era in Mongolia, didn't it?
It did. The sources describe the 1921 revolution led by the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, the MPRP, which had direct Soviet-Russian backing.
But there was resistance to that, too, a counter-revolution.
There was. It challenged the gains of the 1911 revolution, even captured the new Mongolian People's Government briefly, and in response to that, the MPRP and the government formally requested Soviet military intervention.
And the Soviets agreed, but with conditions.
Exactly. The sources highlight Lenin's condition. The Soviet army would help if Mongolia skipped capitalism and adopted the Marxist-Soviet system. That really set the course for the next 70 years.
So the Red Army arrived in July 1921, secured the capital, Ulaanbaatar, and the initial idea of a constitutional monarchy. That didn't last long.
Didn't last long at all. It quickly shifted to a one-party socialist system, heavily influenced, really controlled by Soviet interests. The 1924 Constitution was basically modeled on the Soviet one, giving Moscow effective control over policy.
And that led to massive changes internally. Nationalization.
Sweeping nationalization, yeah. Completed by 1928. Agriculture, commerce, trade, industry, health, education, communications, pretty much everything came under state control. The old Bog Khan government monopolies were abolished.
And one of the most devastating parts mentioned is the anti-religion campaign.
Brutal. The sources talk about widespread torture, harassment, executions, imprisonment. They estimate around 155,000 monks and lamas were targeted as enemies of the revolution.
Just horrific numbers.
Terrible. Those who weren't killed or locked up were forced into secular life, secular studies. The sources even mention this distinction the authorities made between positive and negative lamas, probably an attempt to co-opt or control some aspects of religious life while eliminating the rest.
So Mongolia becomes a people's republic, essentially a Soviet satellite.
Effectively, yes. There's a phrase in one source saying this period ensured the peaceful existence of the capitalists, which sounds, well, it sounds like a specific viewpoint from that source, maybe ironic or critical, rather than a standard historical take.
Right. Context needed there. But eventually, formal independence.
Mongolia declared itself an independent republic in 1946, and China recognized that in 1949. But it remained firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit then, to the late 20th century. The winds of change start blowing again.
They do. The sources indicate the collapse of communism over in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s was a huge spark. It gave real hope to a growing popular movement within Mongolia itself.
People were already questioning the system.
Calls for reform have been building since the mid-80s, yeah. Scrutiny of the government was increasing, and then you had events like the Night of Tuxedos, December 10th, 1989. People actually demonstrating, showing solidarity with the reforms happening in Europe.
So this democratic movement built momentum.
Pushed hard for political reform to go along with the economic reforms being proposed. And the result was that major shift after 1990 away from the command economy towards a market-oriented one.
But the sources are pretty clear this transition wasn't easy.
Far from it. Described as painful, it created this really stark divide in society, the winners and the losers. And that led to this widespread feeling of injustice among people who felt left behind, or maybe even exploited by the new system.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the sources describe the outcome as, well, democracy ending up with a market economy perceived as being for the few, of the few, and by the few.
Which leads us right into the challenges and realities facing Mongolia today. The sources outline the current political system, parliamentary democratic republic. President elected for 4 years appoints the PM and cabinet. Parliament, the state Great Khural, is unicameral, 76 members.
Yep, that's the structure. But underneath that, the sources highlight some really deep challenges. Significant class and social inequality, really rooted in those post-1990 reforms.
They give stats.
Yeah, like a Gini coefficient, which measures inequality of 0.339 back in 2012. And in 2014, almost a quarter of the population, 23.6%, were below the poverty line. Those are clear signs of big disparities, real hardship for many.
And economically vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. The sources really stress the heavy dependence on one main commodity, coal. That makes the whole economy incredibly sensitive to price swings in China and globally.
There's an example from 2014.
Yeah, they lost over $800 million in export revenue just because coal and copper prices fell. That kind of dependence is risky.
And corruption is mentioned as a major problem.
Pervasive is the word used. The sources talk about the ruling elite using strong-arm tactics combined with a pretty ineffective political opposition. They even list examples officials detained or jailed, a former minister with millions stashed offshore. It paints a picture of constant infighting among officials, which distracts from actually governing.
Then there are environmental issues linked to the economy.
Big time. Major conflicts between economic policies, especially heavy industry like mining, and protecting the environment. The sources report sharply worsening environmental quality, land destruction, water and air pollution problems, even risks of environmental disasters, often tied to old infrastructure or issues within the mining industry itself.
And risks on the bigger economic picture, too. Macroeconomic risks.
Yeah, a pattern of booms followed by busts, like rapid growth, then a severe downturn in 2008, 2009, deteriorating public finances, international markets getting nervous about sovereign risk, and just a general slippage, as they put it, in sound economic management.
And the sources connect that poor economic performance directly to weak institutions.
They do, citing governance indicators that suggest things have actually gotten worse in recent years. Accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, controlling corruption, all areas showing deterioration according to the data cited.
Are there suggested solutions?
The sources do mention potential improvements, mostly focused on strengthening governance and policy, things like making the central bank more independent, being more careful with government spending, prudent fiscal policy, improving public financial management, managing resource revenues better, and cracking down on money laundering and terrorism financing, basically getting the institutional house in order.
Okay, let's shift focus then to Mongolia's place in the world, international relations, defined by that fundamental reality, right? Landlocked between Russia and China.
Absolutely central. The sources call Russia and China the great powers, and their sheer size, population strength. It presents unique challenges for Mongolia.
So Mongolia tries to navigate this, the middle state idea.
Exactly. That's the aspiration described to be this middle state, carefully balancing relationships between Russia, China, and the West.
And it has significant resources.
One of the top 10 resource-rich nations, the sources say, but they also describe it as still being politically, socially, and economically underdeveloped. So that reliance on digging resources out of the ground is both a potential strength and a definite vulnerability internationally.
How are relations with the big neighbors, specifically China?
With China, there's that historical memory, being ruled by the king. After 1990, ties shifted. They went from being blocked during the socialist era to actively seeking economic contact. But it's mostly been focused on commodity trade. The sources note a lack of deeper cooperation in things like science, technology, industry,
and Russia.
Deep historical ties there, of course. Seeking protection back in 1911, then decades as a Soviet satellite. Post-Soviet relations are complex, carrying all that historical baggage.
There's that interesting perspective mention.
Yeah. One source offers this specific Mongolian viewpoint, that maybe delaying reconciliation with China could have led to assimilation, and that allowing Soviet advisors into China was seen, from Ulaanbaatar, as a way to keep China weaker, which actually benefited Mongolia. Fascinating angle. And border disputes have apparently resurfaced too.
What about engaging with the West?
Opportunities there, definitely, but geography and history are constraints. The end of the Cold War, the rise of a more multipolar world, that opened up new possibilities for Mongolia to connect with other partners beyond its immediate neighbors.
And Mongolia's position as a democracy in that region, that's unusual.
Very unusual. A rare developing democracy in East Asia, right next to largely undemocratic countries like China, North Korea, Russia. The sources suggest this gives Mongolia a potential moral authority, maybe an interest in supporting democratic values elsewhere.
Could it give them an advantage in understanding the region?
Potentially. Good credibility with other Eurasian nations, maybe an information or knowledge edge in that complex, often conflicting Eurasian environment. The sources also mention an appreciation in Mongolia for positive international reactions when there are difficulties between Russia and the West, and for ideas that could shift those relationships in ways that might benefit Mongolia.
So there's this ambition for a wider cooperation.
Yeah, for beneficial trilateral cooperation, Russia, China, Mongolia. Trying to position North Asia as this interdependent platform for cooperation, co-prosperity, security. But the sources are realistic. Achieving that ideal scenario is tough, involves high potential costs, and needs unresolved political and sociocultural issues sorted out first.
Okay, finally, woven through all this history, all these modern challenges, is Mongolia's enduring culture and identity.
And the sources are really strong on this. That unbreakable link between the traditional lifestyle, the culture, and the unique fact of being a nomadic pastoralist nation.
Animals, especially horses, seem absolutely fundamental.
Totally fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
One source calls the horse God's gift to mankind. It's way beyond just utility. Livestock, generally camels, yaks, sheep, they shape daily life. They're central to big celebrations like Naadam, the summer festival, or Sagansar, the Lunar New Year. They're woven into beliefs, symbols, artwork, everything.
And the yurt, that's more than just a home.
Oh, much more. It's the iconic symbol of the nomadic pastoralist. Deeply symbolic in its structure, too. The sources mention how different parts relate to directions, east, west, north, south, high and low status areas within it, even culturally loaded phrases associated with it.
And there's a rich physical heritage, too.
Absolutely. Monumental stuff left behind over millennia. Turkic stone tombs, old Khitan walls, Buddhist temples, sites linked to the Mongol Khans, plus incredible craftsmanship in things like saddles, handicrafts, and archaeological sites finding things like China armor, fortresses, manuscripts, those mysterious pyramid or bell-shaped burial mounds.
And the living culture art, music.
Vibrant. Traditional singing, music, dance, folk tales. Oral literature is huge. Epic poetry, folk music, kudu. These aren't just entertainment. They're living history, reflecting daily life, historical events, newer forms too, plus various dance styles, often imitating nature or animals, expressing deep emotions.
And traditional instruments.
Central to the music, especially the morin kur, the horse-headed fiddle, that's the national instrument. But others too, like the yathagan, chinri, tofshur, stringed wind percussion. And again, moral beliefs, traditions, they're often passed down through this oral literature, shared at gatherings.
And the language itself, Mongolian.
Key to identity, of course. Part of the Altaic language family, ties going back maybe 3,000 years. Khalkha is the main dialect today. The sources trace its development, including adopting, then ditching the Latin alphabet, and the huge influence of Russian on vocabulary and script during the Soviet era.
Right.
There were efforts to create a standard Khalkha language, despite some opposition. It's morphologically quite structured, but hasn't diversified into wildly different dialects across its range. Still, that linguistic history is complex, tied up with all the political shifts.
And there was a conscious effort recently to revive traditions.
Yes, a cultural renaissance, these sources call it. Late 80s post-socialist era. A real rehabilitation of traditional practices, beliefs, the language, history, culture. Seen as this powerful reawakening of dormant creativity. Even interest in Japan saw a revival then.
So wrapping it all up, looking at Mongolia's place in the grand sweep of world history, the contribution seems pretty clear.
Significant, definitely. That strategic position, the rise of those powerful nomadic empires, especially the Mongol Empire, it literally reshaped the world map, brought cultures into contact like never before, facilitated that massive overland trade network, a true link between East and West.
But then followed by those long periods of decline, fragmentation, foreign rule. And today, Mongolia is, well, a relatively small, very sparsely populated country.
About 3.3 million people total, yeah. And nearly half of them, 1.5 million, live in the capital, Ulaanbaatar, a landlocked nation navigating its modern reality.
Yeah.
What's just fascinating, I think, is tracing that whole arc from being the absolute center of the world's biggest contiguous land empire, a society rooted so deeply in that mobile nomadic past through centuries outside control, to now charting a course as a parliamentary democracy, aspiring to be this middle state in a globalized world that, let's face it, still operates a lot on territorial power.
It really is a story of incredible resilience, isn't it? Constant adaptation. And that persistent identity, tied so strongly to the land, to the horse, even as life becomes more urban or globally connected. So as we finish this deep dive, what does it all mean for Mongolia's future? You've got this incredibly powerful but also tumultuous history, this unique culture so tied to the environment, and this current reality squeezed between giants, grappling with serious internal issues like corruption, economic dependence. What kind of path do you think Mongolia is on? How much will that deep, deep past shape its ability to thrive or just survive in the decades ahead? Definitely something to mull over as you continue your own deep dives.